There's a kind of identity that forms in the background, and it's not necessarily from conscious belief, but from repetition, from how often we are needed, and from how rarely we're asked, who are you when you're not doing anything for anyone? See, some of us don't even have an answer to that question because usefulness has become the substitute for our worth. Being helpful became the way that we got to stay in the room, and being needed became the only time that we really felt visible. And at some point, we, we, we stopped asking if we were loved, and instead we started asking if we were helpful enough to actually be kept around. So we didn't choose this script, though. I think it was handed to us. Sometimes it was done explicitly, other times in silence. And maybe it began in childhood, where the only time that we got attention was when we cleaned up, or when we helped out, when we stayed quiet. Maybe it came later, though, in churches or in workplaces or in relationships that you were in, where love looked more like a transaction than the truth, where doing things for people felt safer than asking them just to see us, where performing competence meant that we wouldn't really be abandoned. And so we got good at this. We became essential and reliable and competent. We knew how to show up, how to anticipate, how to take things off people's plates before they even asked. And everyone appreciated that. They appreciated us. But no one ever paused to wonder, but who are you when you're not being of service? We we didn't know to watch for this because we never had the chance to learn or find out. This is the hidden grief of being useful. You become the person that everyone depends on, but no one actually really knows you. They see your function, your functionality, but not necessarily your fear. They praise your performance, but they never ask about your pain. They love how you make them feel, but they never ask you what it costs to keep showing up like this. And slowly, the only version of yourself that you recognize is the one who's carrying everyone else. You don't rest, you reset. You don't receive, you just re-engage. You just say, of course, to everyone. Not because you have nothing else to give, but more so because you don't know who you are when you're not giving. Now, this is not pride. It's not martyrdom, I think. It's just become more your identity. You've become the strong one because strength kept you close. You became capable because capability meant that they would come to you, right? You became helpful one because being helpful felt like the only way that you could be held. And now you're just tired in a way that's hard to name. Not physically, although there is that, but more so existentially. You feel stretched across people's needs, pulled thin, if you will, by tasks that no one sees and emotions that no one really thanks you for managing. You find yourself in rooms that are full of people who rely on you, but who don't really see you. And you find yourself surrounded by connections that feel real, but only as long as you keep performing. And you wonder quietly and painfully if you stop being useful, will they still come to you? This is the moments that I want to name something vulnerable. Usefulness is not the same as love. Being needed is not the same as being known. And showing up for everyone else is not the same as being connected. That's the wound that we've been tending without naming. That's the pain that we've mistaken for purpose. That's the reason I think our bodies stay tight, even when our calendars are full of meaningful work. We are overfunctioning to earn connection, and we're losing ourselves in this whole process. But this isn't the end of the story, though. See, this is just the beginning of remembering, really. Remembering the part where we ask, maybe for the first time, what do I feel when I'm not managing something? What do I do, or what do I want if someone is asking to help or fix? What happens in the space where I'm not useful, but I'm just present in here? These answers might come slowly. They might bring tears. They might feel like absence at first. But absence isn't always a void. Sometimes absence is the first breath that you take in the part of you that you've buried for such a long time. There's something disorienting about being still when you've built your value around being in motion. So stillness feels kind of lazy, right? Feels like you're failing, and the, you feel guilty because usefulness was never just a behavior. It was more your personality. See, you become the person who always had the answer, the one who always jumped in, the one who's always absorbing the weight and the confusion and the dysfunction and the mess. And you got good at managing this. So good, in fact, that people stopped asking if you wanted to do it. They just assumed that you would do it. And you did too. Because what happens when you slow down and no one checks in? I mean, what happens when you stop being useful and the phone stops ringing? Well, suddenly you start to wonder if the connection was ever really real or just circumstantial. I mean, it's hard to admit that most of our relationships have been built on doing things, that our presence was invited when it meant that we were lightening someone else's load, but not when it came to actually sharing the weight of our own as well. It's hard to admit when we've built a life around being needed and never learned how to be held. That's what happens when your value gets fused with your service. You lose the right to simply exist. You become essential, but expendable, loved and not really known. You're in demand, but you're never really met. And when you try to stop or pause or ask for something instead of offering it, the silence that follows, it can be deafening. And so we start again. We say yes, we jump in, we offer, not because we want to, but because not doing feels like disappearing. Because who even are we if we're not being helpful? And that question haunts us because we never were taught that identity could be rooted in anything other than being functional. We don't know who we are without productivity, without servicing, without emotionally having a return of investment of being the go-to person. We are scared to find out. And maybe it's that fear, that threshold, maybe that discomfort, it isn't a warning. Maybe it's more so just a signal that something was buried deep within that wants to breathe again. We've mistaken our usefulness for intimacy. And intimacy is not built on utility. Intimacy is built on truth. And truth doesn't ask, what can you do for me? It asks, can I be with you even when you have nothing to offer? That's the question that we're learning to ask now of others and of ourselves. Because something inside of us is ready to finally say, I don't want to be indispensable, but I want to be known. I don't want to be everyone's first call in crisis. I just want to be someone's safe place when nothing's wrong. I don't want to be needed. I just want to be loved. This shift, it's not selfish. It's a sacred one. And it begins by disrupting the bargain that we did not know that we had signed up for in the first place. That being useful was the only option of being invisible, contributing or disappearing, earning or losing it. This was survival. It's not the story that we want to continue, though. So, where does this potential new story begin? It begins in the awkward, quiet, uncomfortable moments where we don't jump in, where we don't offer, where we don't say yes just because we can. It begins when we pause instead of please, when we rest instead of trying to prove, when we say no thank you, not out of resistance, but out of reclamation. It begins when we stop filling every silence with service and allow instead a space for your presence. That's not laziness. I would say that's the beginning of a legacy, because that's the one we're building right now. This legacy away from constant productivity into being embodied in our humanity. There's a version of connection that doesn't quite require usefulness to sustain it. It's a version of love that doesn't feel like a transaction, a version of friendship that is not built on what you're offering or fixing or even managing. And that version of connection begins where performance ends. But getting there means we need to let go of the control that the usefulness once gave you. Because here's the hard truth. Being useful gave you a kind of power, a power to stay close, right? A power to avoid rejection, a power to create stability when everything felt chaotic. And when you lived in systems that made love conditional, or usefulness, our usefulness became this lifeline. We got to avoid abandonment by being needed, and we got to avoid conflict by being helpful, and we got to avoid our own pain by always being in motion, right? But eventually, even the most reliable tools will break down. And the tool that we've been using, this identity of always having something to give, well, that's now making us feel hollow. Because love that's earned through utility is not love. It's obligation dressed up as appreciation. And you are made for more than that. There's a grief that rises when you realize you've been sustaining relationships that don't actually sustain you. When you start to see the imbalance, for example, the silence on the other end when you stop reaching out, the one-sidedness when you stop initiating, the way that people pull back when you stop over-functioning. This observation hurts because somewhere along the way you hope that being indispensable would eventually lead to actually being held. And those are not the same thing. Being glue doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be cherished. Being the fixer does not mean that you're going to be understood. Being reliable does not mean that you're going to be known. And so you start to mourn all the ways that you've been showing up for everyone else just so you could feel close while never once fully feeling like you were seen. That grief is not a sign that something is wrong with you, though. It's a sign that you're waking up. You're waking up to a truth that may have felt dangerous before. See, you don't need to earn your place, and you don't need to perform for your worth. You don't need to even stay useful to stay lovable. That's the thunder reframe there. That's the storm that clears this old story. It's loud, it's disorienting, it changes everything, yes. Because when you drop the role that you've been sustaining or holding to be useful, you discover the real you underneath it all. And maybe you don't recognize that person at first. Maybe they feel unfamiliar or underdeveloped or quiet. And that's okay. This is not a loss. This is a return. And now we're beginning to ask different questions. Now we're not asking, what do they need from me, right? Or what can I fix here? Or how can I keep the peace, right? No, now you're asking, what do I want to bring, if anything? Or what does honesty sound like in this room? What would it mean to let someone show up for me? These questions can feel unbearable at first because when we've only ever been useful, receiving can feel foreign. But receiving is not a weakness. Receiving is a recalibration. It's a realignment. And it's how the imbalance finally starts to heal. So what does this look like? It looks like saying, I'm not available right now, and then not rushing to explain yourself. It looks like letting someone else take the lead and resisting that impulse to step in. Not volunteering just because you have the time. Or not offering advice just because you know what to say. And most of all, it means letting someone show up for you without jumping in to reciprocate. That's not selfish. I would say that's intimacy. Because intimacy is not measured by what you're offering. Intimacy is measured by what you allow others to see in you. And you are allowed to be seen even when you're empty. You're not a role. You're not a task list. You're not the sum of your output. You are the emotional scaffolding for every person that you love. And the moment that you stop performing that version of yourself, you begin to meet the parts that never had permission to exist within you. The parts that feel aimless, the parts that aren't efficient, the parts that don't know what to offer and are scared that without something to give, they'll be abandoned. But they won't. Because what's coming now is a new kind of belonging. A belonging that's now rooted not in usefulness, not earned through fixing, but it's anchored instead in your presence. The truth is, people who can only love when they're useful were never really loved in the first place. They were being loved for the service that they provided. And you're no longer interested in being a service provider in your own relationships, right? You're now not offering packages. You're offering instead your presence. And presence, being present in that moment, does not come with productivity metrics. It just shows up. It shows up messy and honest and real and raw and sometimes tired and quiet and unsure at times of what to even say. And still, in the midst of all that, it's worthy of love. You're allowed to opt out of the systems that taught you that love must be earned. You're allowed to stop mid-sentence and say, oh, I don't want to carry this anymore. You're allowed to be the one who just needs, the one who doesn't need to supply all the time. You're not being selfish. You're not being lazy. You're not falling apart. What you're doing is you're remembering. And your remembering is not necessarily glamorous. It could be more clumsy and disruptive and painful too. But it is sacred. Because in the stillness, it's then that you begin to hear your own voice again. The voice that isn't trying to be useful, but the one that's trying to translate itself to be really seen. Not for approval, but just because it's there in the moment. And maybe for now, maybe that's just enough. Not producing, not fixing, not answering every call, but just being. Sitting in a room without anticipating anyone's needs. Having a conversation where you don't solve anything. Letting yourself rest, even if no one praises you for it. See, these moments might feel empty, but they're actually full of life. They're full of self. They're full of the version of you that's been waiting to be invited back into the center of your own life. See, the thing is, you matter even when you're not needed. You belong even when you're not performing. And you're lovable even when you're not holding it all together. That's not a new belief. That's actually an ancient truth that your body already knows. It's hiding beneath the armor, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the role that you've been playing. And so now you let it rise, not in a burst, but in a breath. One brave, quiet breath at a time that says, I'm still here, even when I'm not useful, even when I have nothing to offer, even when I'm just me. And that is enough. I hope this has served you well. Let me know your thoughts in the comments.